50 years ago, secret biological warfare trials were carried out in the skies and on the streets of East Anglia without the public knowing. So alarming are our discoveries that tonight's programme is an Inside Out special.
Were 3 deaths from cancer in this woman's family the result of spraying cadmium from military aircraft?
I really put it down to the cadmium being dropped, and it was settled into the soil.
It was top secret. It mustn't be told to the people what was happening. I think it does matter, you know, in terms of the health of people, that they know that this is being inflicted on them.
In the 1950s, as the Cold War escalated, there were fears that Britain, as an exposed, vulnerable island, could be devastated by a biological or chemical warfare attack.
In readiness for possible war, people living in vast areas of Bedfordshire, Norfolk and the East Coast became guinea pigs in covert defence experiments. Inside Out disentangles the facts from the deceit to reveal a disturbing chapter of secret history that may prove to be at odds with the official line. A chemical concoction comprising cadmium was used to mimic how a biological germ cloud would spread if Soviet Russia released one during an attack on us. Rural Bedfordshire was sprayed from aircraft and, more shockingly, from a converted lorry. The city of Norwich was hit over a sustained period. The Ministry of Defence have consistently said there was no significant health risk as a result of the experiments.
I used to work in the cancer field, and I always knew that cadmium, you know, was a deposit in your body that you oughtn't to have. Why they chose cadmium, why they did the whole test, you know, is a mystery to me.
In 1963, Norfolk was first sprayed with this chemical. At the time, Yvonne Jarman lived on Halvergate Marshes near Great Yarmouth. There was no history of cancer in her family before then.
First of all, my mother had esophageal cancer and she died with it, and then my sister, she had esophageal cancer and she died with it October 2005, and then my brother, he died with it, and this was earlier this year, and now I've got it.
What would happen quite often is a plane will fly off the coast, started at Cromer, flew down past Lowestoft, down the east coast and then along the English Channel, always spraying zinc cadmium sulfide all the time, quite large quantities of it, at least £1 a mile. They didn't check this substance for toxicity prior to the spraying, or indeed even afterwards. The former important scientist who investigated this in 1999 was quite surprised that no one had bothered to research on how this would affect the public.
This is a copy of the official report. It acknowledges that cadmium is a poisonous heavy metal, but it was not tested for its toxicity prior to the experiments. Alarmingly, this was admitted to be a deficit.
No one appears to have looked into the ramifications of breathing this substance in, especially in the size that they sprayed it in, between 1 and 5 microns, which obviously means that it gets deep into your lungs.
Coming up, the lanes of Bedfordshire turned into an outside laboratory.
In and around Cardington, at least 55 field tests were carried out over a 6-year period. We discovered that 32 of them involved the use of a specially converted van. This enabled the chemical compound to be sprayed secretly out of a vent in the roof.
The main thing with the Cardington trials was the amount of experiments that were carried out per day. Sometimes, the minimum I think was 4, and then the maximum was 6 on some days. So many trials were done on the same day. The quantities were huge. In fact, Porton Down sprayed in one series of trials in one day. They sprayed so much that all the trials results merged together. They couldn't tell the individual trials apart. Scientists who were actually providing the source, they were completely protected against this substance. Yet, a few yards away from the van, there were people walking around totally unprotected. It sounds dramatic, but there would have been newborn babies in prams, there would have been young children, there would have been old people, there would have been people with asthma. If you lived next to that route, you were really taking in quite a large dosage over a very small period of time.
And now that you know a van drove around the village lane spraying cadmium, does that horrify you?
It does horrify me, yeah, especially where the children are involved as well, and the idea of spraying different villages, the roads in different villages, is absolutely abhorrent, as far as I'm concerned. Should never have happened.
This lack of thoroughness by Porton Down caused a problem for the Labour government in 1999. Fearful of inheriting something damaging from the past, they ordered a review into whether there were any health risks from the trials.
We have now seen the missing documents, and these show that there were more trials, but they were never officially reported.
We do not have detailed accounts of the land release at Cardington. We have them from Bewley, but you've just shown me some figures, and the highest figures at Bewley were much higher. So the calculations made at Bewley are more pessimistic than those would be made from the figures you've just shown me.
The scientists in the back of the lorry were dressed in full protective clothing, yet just a few feet away in the villages the lorry passed through, people would have been exposed to quite a lot, wouldn't they?
I do not know the details exactly how this was done. I don't suppose they did it in built-up areas. I don't imagine they did it where there were people about. But I don't know. You may have more descriptions of that, since this particular document wasn't available to us at that time. We weren't asked to consider whether this was an efficient way of predicting biological warfare. But if you ask me just as an uninformed observer, I think this was actually a very sensible way of doing it. And they were very similar to the trials that were done in the United States at the same time.
So what is safe exposure to a poison? In the States, the trials in the 1950s and 60s were more openly known about, and there were people prepared to speak out against toxic spraying in public places. An environmental professor, Art Spomer, became concerned about the deliberate exposure of cadmium to humans.
Professor Spomer told his superiors about the potential risks of open-air spraying, but initially he was ignored. It was only when he published a scientific article that anyone took any notice.
Spomer's article was based on medical research into cadmium poisoning done as early as the 1930s. It was known then that cadmium entering the human body in any dosage or concentration was harmful to health. Inside Out tracked him down to his home in Illinois, and he agreed to talk to us.
Professor Spomer, do you still stand by what you wrote about the effects of inhaling cadmium?
Yeah, I don't think anything has changed since that. I'm not a medical person, and I don't directly follow that literature, but I don't think anything's changed.
Do you think the fluorescent particle trials should have ever taken place in the UK?
I have no idea why they did them, because they had better ways to study what they were trying to find out. And so I'm not quite sure why they... I think it was an unnecessary hazard to expose people to this material, whether they knew it was toxic or not. Although, again, they should have known cadmium. Cadmium is known for a long time to be toxic.
Should zinc cadmium ever be inhaled or ingested into the body?
No, not intentionally. Yeah, no.
Well, I think the main issue, as far as we're concerned, was the frequency as to how many times this was done. And this van went round the village lanes and sprayed sometimes 5-6 times a day from the top of the van.
Oh my God! Yeah, well, it's stupid science. And if in this case if they had some knowledge of the toxicity of the material, it's probably criminal.
There just isn't any evidence, and it isn't that people haven't looked. So, I mean, he can say what he likes. Until he produces some evidence to the contrary, this is typical of a particular kind of argument to raise anxiety.
It's worrying that Professor Lackman has not seen all the evidence. I mean, that raises the question of whether or not the Ministry of Defence should carry out a new inquiry.
I was approached at my house by a gentleman who said that he was monitoring or recording the pollution from the traffic. He was a man about 45, average build, and wearing a long dark coat and a trilby. I feel completely disgusted that they should have used this cadmium sulfide when they knew that it was a very dangerous poison.
No one was to know. As we now know, police officers were involved. They were not told why. An aircraft would take off, It would fly 25 miles away from the centre of Norwich at night. It would be spraying out zinc cadmium sulphide all the time. The official Porton history of the zinc cadmium sulphide programme says a very strange thing about Norwich. It says that the exposure was, however, considerable. This is a very strange statement. They do not make this statement for the rest of the trials that were carried out, and there's over 100 of them in the UK. But in Norwich, they specifically mentioned that it was a considerable exposure.
Cadmium naturally resides in the soil, but any increase in the levels present as a result of these trials and any potential health risks are causing concern. Jean Cordy grew up next to an allotment where one of these sampling machines was placed.
I believe that there could be a link between my mother's cancer and the tests that were carried out over Norwich from the fact that we ate our own vegetables that my father grew. I'm also concerned that my brother and I, as we ate the same produce, might actually end up with the same disease as my parents did. My mother was a brilliant grandmother, absolutely adored her grandchildren, and she always looked on them as her boys, always used to ask how her boys were, and I know of anything that they'd miss her, and you know, she missed seeing them growing up, which is unfair.
We do indeed see more patients, newly diagnosed patients with esophageal cancer than we might expect to see for the population, and certainly compared to some other parts of the country. Many of them will have worked on or lived off the land. It's quite striking, but I think that probably reflects the part of the country that we're in. We're in a part of the country that's, of course, intensely agricultural, and I think that to some extent reflects that. But it is something that would, I think, make one look for a possible link.
Last winter, Wyn Parry and Norwich North MP Dr Ian Gibson, amid a flurry of newspaper coverage, forced a health inquiry. It reported that there were indeed significantly high numbers of throat cancer in Norfolk.
The fact that we have many more patients with cancer of the esophagus in Norfolk than we might expect to see for our population. And we also have the fact that in the 1960s, a chemical was dropped over part of Norfolk and a sizable part of Norwich that we know can cause health risks.
And whether there's any possibility of there being any incidences of cancer, any clusters of cancer that might possibly have been related to this. And I think that work has to start now, because with this being so long covered over, having brought it to mind now, we've got to find out in order to reassure people to make sure they know that they're safe.
From what we understand of cadmium, it can remain in the environment for some time afterwards. I think if they were aware of the full spectrum of risks, then it was probably questionable at very best.
Now they have to admit that actually since the tests, doubts about the safety of that compound have arisen. And that, I think that's very politically damaging for them. And the problem that they've got is that they're left with not very reliable data, but also the other problem that they have is that they've released a whole load of material out into the countryside, and they're not absolutely sure how much they have actually released, which causes them a problem when they're asserting that it's completely safe. I mean, it's a bit of a cock-up, really.
I'm not particularly looking forward to what the times ahead, because it's certainly not a very pleasant death. And I think this is an absolute dreadful thing. I think they're just sweeping everything under the carpet, and just how they always do with everything.
Quite often it's just getting that public apology that's important. Some minister, some Prime Minister has to stand up and say sorry about what happened years ago.
The population of Norfolk, the population around Bedford, in fact the whole east of England, could still be at risk from future experiments, which the Ministry of Defence refused to rule out.